My name is Maya, and for as long as I can remember, the world has felt far too loud. While most people seem to navigate life with an innate sense of volume control, I have always felt like a radio tuned to a frequency that picks up every single vibration, every judgment, and every overwhelming demand for attention. I am a wildlife biologist, a title that allows me to justify my deep-seated need for isolation under the guise of scientific necessity. For the past 3 years, my world has been reduced to a weathered, one-room cabin nestled in the heart of the Denali Wilderness in Alaska. Out here, the only eyes that track my movements belong to the gray wolves of the Clearwater pack, and they don't expect me to make small talk, perform social graces, or laugh at jokes that carry no meaning. To many, this level of solitude would be a psychological prison sentence. To me, it is the only place where my lungs can truly expand without the feeling that I am stealing oxygen from someone more deserving of the space. I am what you would call painfully shy, but even that phrase feels like a shallow descriptor for a profound internal fortress. My shyness isn't just a personality trait, it is a visceral, physical barrier. When I am thrust into a social situation, my throat constricts as if a heavy weight is pressing against my windpipe. My skin turns a violent, betraying shade of red, and my brain dissolves into a chaotic white noise. I have spent my entire life fleeing from the roar of humanity, and in the frozen, crystalline silence of the Alaskan interior, I believed I had finally found my permanent sanctuary. Growing up in the rain-dampened suburbs of Seattle, I was the girl in the back of the classroom who treated eye contact like a dangerous weapon. I can still vividly recall the paralyzing, bone-deep fear of show and tell, the way my hands would tremble so violently that I would drop whatever object I was supposed to be describing, my voice vanishing into a dry, hollow croak. I wasn't slow, and I wasn't cold, despite what my peers might have assumed. I was simply overwhelmed by the sheer intensity of the world. While other children were forming intricate social cliques, trading gossip, and shouting across playgrounds, I was usually found in the farthest corner of the yard, sitting perfectly still for hours on end, watching spiders weave their silver webs or a line of ants navigate the cracks in the pavement. I found a deep, soul-level comfort in the predictable, honest patterns of nature. Animals don't judge you for a stutter, and a forest doesn't care if you lack the charisma to command a room. In university, my professors labeled me a brilliant ghost. I submitted research papers that were so meticulous and insightful they were cited by industry veterans, yet I nearly failed my master's program because the thought of standing on a stage to defend my thesis felt like walking toward a firing squad. I eventually carved out a niche in remote field research. The more isolated the location, the better I functioned. My colleagues at the Fairbanks regional office call me the Shadow, a nickname born from my habit of appearing only once every few weeks to drop off data logs and pick up essential supplies. They've long since stopped inviting me to their Friday night gatherings. They see my mud-caked truck pull into the lot, they see me scurry into the supply room like a startled rabbit, and they see me vanish back into the trees before the first beer can has even been cracked open. My work in the Denali Wilderness is focused almost exclusively on the Clearwater pack, a family of 7 wolves led by a magnificent, battle-scarred alpha female I've named Hera. My days are strictly governed by their movements, a rhythmic dance of survival that I observe from a respectful distance. I wake up at 4 a.m., a time when the stars are still sharp enough to pierce the dark velvet of the sky. I spend my mornings in a state of meditative focus, tracking paw prints in the fresh, waist-deep powder, checking the hidden thermal cameras I've strategically placed near their winter den, and meticulously collecting hair and scat samples for DNA analysis. It is tedious, exhausting, and often bone-chillingly cold work, and I cherish every grueling second of it. Over the years, I've developed an almost psychic sixth sense for Hera's movements. I can feel when the pack is migrating toward the northern ridge or when they've made a fresh kill in the valley floor. There is a profound, ancient dignity in their silence. They communicate through the subtle twitch of an ear, the slow tilt of a powerful head, or a low, vibrating rumble that carries more weight and meaning than any 1,000-page political manifesto. In their presence, I don't feel like a broken human who failed the social exam. I feel like I am part of a different kind of conversation, one that is ancient, honest, and requires absolutely no spoken words. I genuinely believed that this was how the rest of my life would unfold, as a silent, invisible observer in a world that had no need for me to ever raise my voice. But the silence of the wilderness is a fragile, precious thing, and it only takes one artificial, human sound to shatter it into a million jagged pieces. The first time I felt the vibration, I didn't even hear it with my ears. I felt it in the soles of my boots and the pit of my stomach. Initially, I dismissed it as a low-altitude cargo plane or perhaps a minor seismic tremor. But as the days bled into weeks, the sound intensified into a constant, rhythmic, mechanical grind that seemed to vibrate the very marrow of my bones. It was coming from the West Basin, a territory that was supposed to be strictly protected under federal law as a wildlife sanctuary. One morning, driven by a nagging, gnawing sense of dread that I couldn't ignore, I hiked 10 grueling miles through knee-deep snow and jagged ice to reach the summit of the North Ridge. I crawled forward on my stomach, my white winter parkas camouflaging me perfectly against the drifts, and peered over the rocky ledge. What I saw in the valley below made the blood in my veins turn to ice. In the very heart of the Clearwater Pack's primary hunting ground, a massive, industrial drilling rig had been erected like a metal monster. Unmarked trucks were carving deep, black scars into the ancient permafrost, and thick, acrid smoke was belching into the pristine, blue-black sky. I recognized the logo on the side of the heavy equipment, Apex Mineral Resources. They weren't supposed to be here. This was a sanctuary, a place where the wild was meant to be left untouched. As I watched, a crew of men in orange vests dumped a drum of dark, oily fluid directly into the pristine stream that fed the entire valley. My heart hammered against my ribs with a violence I hadn't felt in years, but for the first time in my life, the fear wasn't about my own social inadequacy. It was for the wolves. It was for the land. I reached for my camera, my hands suddenly steady with a cold, focused, and terrifyingly clear anger. The shadow was no longer just watching. The shadow was collecting evidence for a war it never wanted to fight. The following days were a feverish blur of adrenaline, stealth, and a terrifying sense of purpose. I realized very quickly that if I simply retreated to my cabin and attempted to call the authorities via my satellite phone, the men in the valley would likely pack up their mobile rig and vanish long before any government official could navigate the terrain, leaving behind nothing but a toxic, irreparable mess that would poison the ecosystem for decades. I couldn't take that risk. I had to document the absolute, undeniable scale of their operation. I began living out of my rucksack, sleeping in short, shallow 4-hour shifts under the low-hanging, snow-laden branches of ancient spruce trees. I moved like a predator myself, always staying downwind and using the deep shadows of the ridges to creep closer to their perimeter than any sane person would dare. I captured everything through my lens: the systematic illegal dumping of industrial lubricants, the unauthorized explosives they were using to fracture the rock, and the clear, high-resolution faces of the foremen overseeing the destruction. Through the viewfinder of my camera, I felt a strange sense of detachment from my own paralyzing fear. As long as I was acting in my capacity as the biologist, I could function with surgical precision. But every time I stopped to think about what I would eventually have to do with this evidence, the people I would have to face, the voices I would have to challenge, the old Maya, the girl who would rather hide in a closet than answer a ringing phone, began to scream in the back of my mind. By the fourth night of my reconnaissance, I had gathered more than enough. My high-speed memory cards were filled with gigabytes of raw, undeniable proof that Apex Mineral Resources was running a clandestine, high-stakes copper prospecting operation in the middle of a federal wildlife sanctuary. But the most damning piece of evidence came on the final night, when I managed to belly crawl to within 20 feet of their primary command tent. The wind was howling, masking the sound of my movement as I pressed myself into the frozen earth. Through a narrow gap in the heavy canvas flap, I saw a large-scale map spread across a folding table. It wasn't just a survey map for a few test holes. It was a comprehensive, multi-year blueprint for a massive, open-pit mine that would effectively swallow the entire Clearwater Valley. Beside the map lay a signed contract, and even from my distance, I could see the official seal of the State Land Office. This wasn't just a rogue crew of miners, it was a high-level conspiracy involving government corruption. My stomach turned with a wave of literal nausea. I realized then that if I wanted to stop this, a simple anonymous email or a phone call wouldn't suffice. In a system this corrupted, anonymous tips are the first things to be lost or deleted. I needed to go to the oversight board in Anchorage in person. I needed to stand in front of a panel of the most powerful people in the state and tell them exactly what I had seen with my own eyes. The sheer weight of that realization felt like it was crushing my ribs. I wanted to bury myself in the snow, to let the cold take me, and never have to speak to another soul again. I hiked back to my hidden truck in the midst of a mounting blizzard, the wind shrieking through the pines like a wounded animal. My mind was a chaotic battlefield of conflicting instincts. The loudest voice in my head was the one that had kept me safe for 28 years, the voice that told me to stay in the shadows. "You're a ghost, Maya," it whispered with cold, logical precision. "You don't have a voice that anyone respects. You'll just stand there, you'll stutter, you'll turn red, and you'll ruin the only chance these animals have. They'll look at you and see a fragile, broken girl, and they'll laugh you out of the room." It was a compelling argument because it was based on every social failure I had ever experienced. But then I forced myself to think about Hera. I thought about the 3 pups that were due to be born in the spring, only to emerge into a world where their water was poisoned with heavy metals and their ancestral home was being excavated by machines. I thought about the silence I had spent my life searching for, and how it was currently being sold to the highest bidder for copper and greed. I reached my truck, my fingers so numb they felt like wooden blocks as I struggled to turn the ignition key. As the old heater finally sputtered to life, blowing a thin stream of lukewarm air onto my frozen face, I looked at my reflection in the cracked rearview mirror. I looked haggard, pale, and absolutely terrified. But behind the wide, haunted eyes of the girl who couldn't speak, I saw a flicker of something I didn't recognize, a hard, diamond-bright spark of absolute, unyielding duty. The 6-hour drive from the Denali border to the city of Anchorage was the longest, most agonizing journey of my life. The highway was a treacherous ribbon of black ice and blinding whiteouts, and the further south I traveled, the more the world began to close in on me like a trap. The majestic, towering spruce trees slowly gave way to road signs, then clusters of houses, then the sprawling, neon-lit, chaotic concrete mess of the city. To a woman who had spent the last 3 years in the company of wolves and trees, Anchorage felt like an active war zone. The noise was an unrelenting assault, the scream of sirens, the rhythmic throb of tires on wet pavement, the distant, muffled bass of music from passing cars. I felt like my skin had been peeled off and every nerve ending was exposed to the air. I checked into a cheap, nondescript motel on the outskirts of town, my hands shaking so violently that the teenage receptionist had to ask me 4 separate times to repeat my last name for the ledger. I spent the entire night in a room that smelled of stale tobacco and industrial-strength floor cleaner, staring at the blue glow of my laptop screen. I organized my photographs into a logical, devastating presentation. I wrote out my formal testimony, word for word, color-coding the key points so I wouldn't lose my place when the inevitable panic set in. I practiced my delivery in front of the cracked, yellowed bathroom mirror, my voice sounding thin, fragile, and terrified. My name is Maya Larson. I am a field biologist for the Denali Research Station. Each word felt like a heavy stone I was trying to vomit up. I didn't sleep a single minute. I simply watched the gray, urban sun rise over the flat rooftops of Anchorage, knowing that in a matter of hours, I would have to do the one thing I feared more than death. I would have to be seen, and I would have to be heard. The Board of Oversight building was a towering, modern monolith of reflective glass and cold steel that seemed to reach up into the low-hanging, oppressive clouds of the Alaskan coast. I stood on the sidewalk for nearly half an hour, completely paralyzed by the sight of people in sharp, expensive suits and the local news vans with their telescoping antennas parked at the curb. I felt like a prehistoric creature that had been captured and dragged into a high-tech laboratory for dissection. My hiking boots were scuffed and stained with the mud of the North Ridge, my outdoor jacket was faded from the sun and wind, and my skin felt several sizes too tight for my body. Every time I tried to force my legs to walk toward those heavy revolving doors, my muscles would lock up in a state of pure, instinctual rebellion. I watched a group of men in charcoal overcoats walk into the building, laughing and speaking with a booming, effortless confidence. They looked so comfortable in their skin, so entirely entitled to the space they occupied and the air they breathed. I realized, with a sinking feeling in my gut, that they were likely the high-priced legal team representing Apex Mineral Resources. They had millions of dollars behind them, they had the favor of the state, and they had voices that were trained to fill a room and command attention. All I had was a single memory card tucked into my pocket and a heart that felt like it was trying to beat its way out of my ribcage. I finally managed to slip inside the building, keeping my head down and my eyes fixed on the patterns of the floor tiles as I followed the sterile, plastic signs to Hearing Room B. The room was already packed to capacity. The air was thick with the scent of over-roasted coffee, expensive cologne, and the palpable, nervous energy of a high-stakes public meeting. I found a seat in the very last row, tucked as far as possible behind a large concrete pillar. I wanted to disappear. I wanted to revert to being the shadow, watching the world from a safe, untouchable distance where no one could look at me or ask me to explain myself. The hearing began with a series of long, mind-numbingly tedious reports on zoning and economic forecasts. I sat there, my hands balled into fists in my lap, feeling the sweat pool at the small of my back. Finally, the chairman, a man with a face like weathered granite, called the representative from Apex Mineral Resources to the podium. A man named Arthur Sterling stood up. He was the embodiment of everything I found terrifying about humanity: silver hair perfectly coiffed, a deep tan that had no business being in Alaska in November, and a voice that sounded like smooth, expensive velvet. He spoke with a practiced, effortless charm about responsible development, economic lifelines for the working class, and minimal environmental impact. He showed a series of glossy, idealized slides that made the planned destruction of the Clearwater Valley look like an act of community service. As Sterling continued to speak, I felt a familiar, burning heat rising in the back of my neck. But this time, it wasn't just my usual, debilitating social anxiety. It was the intense, white-hot heat of a profound, righteous fury. He was lying. He was standing in a room of public officials and lying with a practiced, polished smile on his face, and nearly everyone in the room was nodding along as if his words were divine gospel. I looked at the board members, the people who held the future of my valley in their hands. They were checking their watches, whispering to their aides, and looking generally bored by the proceedings. They were ready to approve the permits. They wanted the tax revenue, they wanted the progress, and they didn't give a damn about a pack of wolves they would never see or a river they would never drink from. I realized, with a clarity that was almost painful, that if I didn't stand up right now, the lie would officially become the truth, and the silence I loved would be silenced forever. My name was suddenly called by the clerk. Maya Larson, field biologist for the Denali Research Station. The room went deathly silent. The television cameras at the front of the room pivoted with a synchronized, mechanical whir that sounded like 1,000 hungry insects. I felt the collective weight of 100 pairs of eyes on me. I tried to stand, but my knees literally buckled, and I had to grab the back of the chair in front of me to keep from falling. I took a deep, shuddering breath, the same 4 counts in, 4 counts out rhythm I had practiced 1,000 times in my cabin and forced my feet to begin the long, agonizing walk down the center aisle. The walk to the podium felt like I was wading through a river of thick, freezing molasses. Every step was a monumental struggle against my own DNA. When I finally reached the front and gripped the edges of the wooden podium, the microphone looked like a silver spear aimed directly at my throat. I looked out at the sea of faces, the cynical reporters with their pens ready, the board members, the smirking, well-fed lawyers from Apex Mineral Resources. My throat completely closed up. I opened my mouth to begin my rehearsed statement, but no sound came out. Not even a whisper. I stood there in a terrifying, suffocating silence for what felt like an eternity. I saw Arthur Sterling lean over to his associate and whisper something with a condescending, predatory grin. He thought I was a joke. He thought I was just another nervous, inconsequential girl from the woods who would crumble and dissolve under the slightest pressure. That specific thought, the sheer, arrogant dismissiveness of it, did what no amount of self-help or bravery could ever do. It snapped my mind into a sharp, crystalline focus. I didn't look at the people anymore. I didn't look at the cameras. I looked at the digital screen as I plugged my laptop into the system with steady fingers. I didn't need to be a public speaker. I didn't need to be charismatic. I just needed to be a biologist. My name is Maya Larson, I said, and my voice was quiet, but the microphone caught it and threw it with authority to the very back of the room. And I am here to show you what minimal impact actually looks like in the real world. I began my presentation with the first image I had taken from the ridge. At first, my voice was still thin and shaky, and I had to stop every few seconds to swallow the thick lump of fear that kept rising in my throat. But as the images began to flash across the massive screen behind the board, the entire atmosphere of the room shifted. I showed them the aerial view of the illegal drill sites, the raw earth bleeding under the weight of the machines. I showed them the high-definition video I'd taken of the toxic, oily runoff flowing directly into the Clearwater headwaters. I showed them the close-up photos of the chemical containers labeled with severe toxic warnings, sitting neglected and leaking inches away from the pack's primary water source. I showed them the maps I'd seen in the tent, the ones that revealed the true, massive scale of the planned mine. The smirks on the faces of the Apex legal team didn't just fade, they vanished entirely, replaced by a frantic, whispered consultation. The board members, who had been looking at their phones only minutes ago, were now sitting bolt upright, their boredom replaced by a sharp, focused, and uncomfortable attention. I wasn't just talking about abstract environmental concepts anymore. I was showing them the undeniable, physical evidence of a multi-million-dollar crime against the state and the land. I found that when I spoke about the science, the specific pH levels of the contaminated water, the precise migration patterns of the wolves, the fragile, irreplaceable nature of the permafrost, my shyness didn't go away. But it became entirely secondary to the mission. The facts were my shield, and the data was my weapon. This valley is the biological heart of the Clearwater pack, I said, my voice growing steadier and more resonant with every slide I presented. It is not an empty, insignificant wasteland as Mr. Sterling would have you believe. It is a complex, delicate, and living system that has existed in equilibrium for thousands of years. The chemicals I personally observed being dumped into the headwaters will not stay confined to this one valley. They will enter the regional water table. They will contaminate the salmon runs that the local communities depend on. They will systematically poison the entire ecosystem of this region for generations to come. I turned my head and looked directly at Arthur Sterling. He was no longer leaning back in his chair. He was hunched over, his face a pale, sickly shade under his artificial tan. I felt a surge of a very specific kind of power that I had never known existed. For the first time in my 28 years of life, I was the one in absolute control of the room. I wasn't a ghost anymore. I was the most important, most dangerous person in the entire building. I wasn't fighting for my own ego or my own career. I was fighting for the things that had no voice, no lawyers, and no seats at the table of power. The period of questioning that followed from the board was intense, aggressive, and designed to break me. The apex lawyers realized they couldn't dispute the photos, so they did what people like them always do. They attacked the witness. One of the senior lawyers stood up, his voice booming with a false sense of indignation. "Miss Larson, isn't it true that you live in total, self-imposed isolation? That you have a documented history of, let's call them social difficulties? Why should this board trust the amateur observations of a woman who clearly has a deep-seated, emotional bias against human development and industrial progress? Isn't it true that you're simply a lonely woman who has projected her own issues onto a pack of wild animals?" The room went very, very still. It was a cruel, low blow, a direct and public attack on my greatest, most painful vulnerability. I felt the old, familiar panic clawing at my chest, the heat rising in my face, the urge to run out of the room and never stop running. I felt the tears stinging the corners of my eyes. But then I looked up at the massive photo of Hera that was still frozen on the screen behind me. She was looking into the camera with a steady, unblinking, and entirely unafraid gaze. She didn't run when things got difficult. She stood her ground and faced the threat to her family. I took a long, slow breath. I didn't blush this time. I didn't look down at my boots. I didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing me crumble. "It is absolutely true that I prefer the company of wolves to the company of people," I said, and my voice was clear, calm, and carried a weight that surprised even me. "But my personal social preferences do not change the chemical composition of the water samples I have provided to this board. My preference for isolation does not change the undeniable fact that Apex Mineral Resources is currently operating an illegal prospecting site in a federal sanctuary. If my so-called social difficulties have made me more observant, more patient, and more dedicated to uncovering the truth than your highly paid legal team, then perhaps this board should listen to me with even greater intensity. The data is before you. You can attack me all you want, but you cannot make these photos disappear." A few people in the back of the audience started to clap, and then the clapping grew into a wave of applause. The chairman banged his gavel repeatedly to restore order, but he was looking at me with a profound newfound respect. I spent the next hour dismantling every technical argument the lawyers threw at me with cold, hard, and undeniable data. When I finally stepped down from the podium, my entire body was trembling with the aftershock of the adrenaline, but it was the trembling of a hunter who had finally hit the mark. The hearing didn't conclude with a sudden, cinematic victory right then and there. Life rarely works that way, especially when millions of dollars and government bureaucracies are involved. These things move with the agonizing slowness of a glacier, and lawyers have a professional specialty in dragging out the inevitable. But the tide had irrevocably turned. The local news stations had picked up the story within the hour, and by the time the evening news aired, the images I had captured were on every television screen across the state of Alaska. The shy biologist became an overnight, viral symbol for the protection of the last great wilderness. As I attempted to leave the building through the side exit, I was immediately swarmed by a wall of reporters and cameramen. The microphones were pushed aggressively into my face, and the flashes from the cameras were like a barrage of strobe lights. For a fleeting second, the old Maya wanted to scream, cover her face, and bolt for the safety of her truck. But I realized that if I ran away now, the story would become about my fear and my instability, not about the wolves or the crime I had uncovered. I forced myself to stand my ground. I answered their questions with as much poise as I could muster. I kept every single answer focused on the Clearwater pack and the environmental impact. I was learning that a voice doesn't have to be loud to be heard, it just has to be consistent. The following few weeks were a surreal, exhausting whirlwind of activity. I didn't go back to my cabin immediately. I stayed in Anchorage, working 12-hour days with environmental lawyers, federal investigators, and representatives from the Department of the Interior. We went over every single photograph, every GPS data log, and every field note I had taken during those 4 days in the trees. The high-ranking official I had seen on the contract in the command tent was placed under immediate federal investigation. As the evidence became public, Apex Mineral Resources saw their stock price plummet as a massive public outcry grew across the country. Protesters began to gather every morning outside their corporate headquarters, many of them carrying signs with Hera's face on them and the words, "The shadow saw you." I was invited to speak at major environmental rallies, to do sit-down interviews on national news programs, and even to sign a lucrative book deal. I turned almost all of it down without hesitation. I didn't want to be a celebrity, and I certainly didn't want to be a professional activist. I just wanted the drilling to stop. I just wanted to go home to the silence. During one of the final, high-pressure meetings with the federal prosecutors, Dr. Miller, my supervisor from the research station, flew down to Anchorage specifically to support me. He sat next to me in a high-rise office building, looking as much like a fish out of water in his worn flannel shirt and work pants as I felt. "You did it, Maya," he whispered to me during a coffee break, his voice booming with a fatherly pride that brought a lump to my throat. "You did more for the protection of this park in one single afternoon than most people manage to achieve in an entire 30-year career. I always knew you were a quiet genius when it came to the wolves, but I had absolutely no idea you had this kind of steel in your spine." I looked at him and gave him a genuine, tired smile. "I didn't either, Dr. Miller," I admitted honestly. "I think I just finally found something that I was more afraid of losing than I was afraid of speaking." He nodded slowly, and for the first time in my life, I didn't mind the direct eye contact. I realized that my shyness wasn't a cage I was trapped in anymore. It was just a part of the landscape of who I was. It was a trait, not a tragedy. It didn't have to be the thing that defined me or the thing that stopped me from doing what was right when the world demanded a witness. The final, absolute victory came on a cold, gray Tuesday morning. The Department of the Interior officially revoked every one of Apex's exploration permits and issued a permanent, ironclad ban on any future mining activity in the Clearwater Basin. The illegal operation was dismantled under federal supervision, and the company was hit with tens of millions of dollars in fines for environmental crimes. The corrupt official from the land office resigned in disgrace only hours before his formal indictment was announced. I received the news while I was sitting on a park bench in downtown Anchorage, watching a group of children play near a frozen fountain. I felt a massive, invisible weight lift off my shoulders, a pressure I hadn't even realized I was carrying since I first heard that mechanical grind in the forest. I had done it. I had used my voice, and against all the money and power of a corporate giant, the world had actually listened. But more than that, I had faced the internal storm that had haunted me since childhood, and I had come out on the other side. I was still the girl who hated crowds and who occasionally stuttered when the pressure was high, but I was also the woman who had saved a wilderness. Returning to my cabin in the Denali wilderness was like waking up from a long, chaotic, and exhausting dream into a reality that was more beautiful than I had ever remembered. The silence of the winter woods was even more profound, more sacred, and more welcoming than it had been before the machines arrived. The air was impossibly crisp, the ancient spruce trees were heavy with the weight of fresh snow, and for the first time in months, the world felt entirely right again. I spent the first few days simply sitting on my small wooden porch, wrapped in a heavy wool blanket, drinking tea and listening to the music of the wind as it moved through the valley. I hadn't realized how much the relentless noise and the constant social pressure of the city had drained my very soul until that noise was finally, blessedly gone. But I was fundamentally different now. I didn't feel the desperate need to hide from the world anymore. When I made my next scheduled supply run to the research station, I didn't scurry into the back room like a ghost. I walked into the main lodge, I said a genuine hello to the rest of the team, and I even stayed for a full hour to share a cup of coffee and a conversation. They treated me with a new kind of warmth, not as a fragile, strange recluse, but as a respected colleague. I was still the shadow, but now it was a title of profound honor, a reminder that the quietest person in the room is often the one who sees the most. A few weeks after my return to the routine of field life, I was out near the North Ridge, performing a routine check on one of my trail cameras. The weather was beginning to turn. A faint, sweet hint of spring was carried on the southern breeze. As I was packing my gear to hike back to my truck, I felt a sudden, familiar shift in the air. I froze instantly, my body automatically becoming a still, silent part of the landscape. Out of the deep shadows of the trees emerged Hera. She was followed closely by the rest of the pack, including the young pup I had photographed during those dark days of the drilling. They were healthy, their coats were thick and glossy, and they moved with a quiet, powerful, and unbothered grace across the valley that was now officially and legally their own. Hera stopped in a clearing and turned her head, looking directly in my direction. She knew exactly where I was. She didn't run, she didn't growl, and she didn't show fear. She just stood there for a long, eternal moment, her amber, intelligent eyes locking onto mine with a steady, unblinking gaze. In that moment of shared silence, I felt a connection that went far beyond the boundaries of science, biology, or research. It was a profound, shared understanding between two creatures who both knew the absolute, inherent value of silence and the necessity of protection. She had no intellectual idea that I had stood in a brightly lit room in Anchorage and fought for her very existence against a room full of powerful men. She didn't know about the cameras, the legal briefs, or the shy biologist who had become a household name. To her, I was simply the human who sat in the woods and watched, the one who didn't hunt and didn't harm. But I knew that because I had finally found the courage to speak up, her world would remain wild, untouched, and whole. She eventually turned her head and led her pack deeper into the ancient trees, disappearing into the shadows like a wisp of gray smoke. I stood there for a long time afterward, the cold wind biting at my cheeks, and I felt a sense of gratitude that was almost overwhelming. I was still shy. I was still a girl of the woods. But I was no longer afraid of my own presence in the world. My life has settled back into its old, familiar rhythm, but it carries a new, deeper resonance. I still spend my days tracking the Clearwater pack and my nights writing my logs by the light of a kerosene lamp. But now I also make time once a month to mentor young biologists who struggle with the same social anxieties and paralyzing fears that I once did. I tell them with absolute certainty that being quiet isn't a weakness and it isn't a defect. I tell them that the world desperately needs people who listen, people who observe, and people who are willing to wait in the silence for the truth to reveal itself. I tell them that when the time finally comes for them to speak, they will find that their voice has a strength they never could have imagined when they were hiding in the shadows. My name is Maya Larson. I am a biologist, a guardian of the wild, and a woman who learned that you don't have to be the loudest person in the room to be the most powerful one. I live in the sacred silence of the Alaskan wilderness, and for the first time in my life, I'm not running away from anything. I am right where I am supposed to be, and my voice is ready for whenever the world needs to hear the truth.